Hello and welcome to this all-new episode of In Session from Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter-Munley, coming to you from the beautiful Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in downtown Bennington. And I am so thrilled to be joined by Senator Rob Plunkett and Representatives Michael Nigro and Timothy Corcoran. We are very likely to be joined by Representative Jonathan Cooper in just a moment, but we're going to get underway. And I'm going to start off with you, Senator Plunkett. You'll probably be unsurprised to hear, just because there's
Yeah,
been some news in the interim since the last time you were on the
right.
show.
Yeah,
We talked about it a little bit with the representatives yesterday, but obviously want to get your personal perspective. Folks may have seen some of it in the news, but with the confirmation of Michael Drescher to the Vermont Supreme Court and your sort of very public role in that. Just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the deliberative process you went through that led you to your vote, and expand a little bit on some of what folks may have seen quoted here and there in other articles about your eventual reasoning for your vote to confirm Michael Drescher.
sure. I'll start with the last in terms of what I was quoted as saying. And frankly, I don't know a lot of it, and I don't have all of it in front of me. What I do know about media in general, basically from my experience as a prosecutor, is they do a great job, but it's not everything. So in terms of sort of expounding on the reasoning, we have the our written floor speeches. Seth was writing on the floor, and he wrote out some of it, and we've sent that out. If anyone wants it, I can send that out, and that is probably the best way of actually explaining it. But in terms of the process, it was weeks long, and it started off fairly early on. My talking to Senator Hashim. He's the chair of Judiciary, and as you may know, in the Senate there are 30 of us, and only three of us are lawyers. Two of us practicing lawyers. Seth is, I think he might still be barred, but he doesn't actually practice. So I didn't make the joke on the floor, but we had three lawyers. Usually, it have four opinions. We only had two in that instance. But I started to talk to Senator Hashim very early on about the role of lawyers, our place in history right now, and what that meant. And quite frankly, one of the earlier conversations I had with some colleagues was quite literally talking about how fascism works and what is our role and what can we do. And so that was really my starting point. Is this a time when we can really fight against fascism? And from that, there were obviously the hearings, there were the pleadings, and a lot of conversations with especially Mike Drescher, but also Christina Nolan to really understand. Discussions with colleagues, um, folks reached out. A lot of them were sort of just vote no. Some others were more in-depth sort of analysis. And especially with one retired judge, I reached out to him and talked to him for a long time about their opinion. And a lot of other folks that knew, especially Mike Drescher, but also Christina Nolan, reached out. So for me, the process was taking in everything that I possibly could and really doing a deep dive analysis of it, and looking at, and it's I mentioned in the floor speech some of the sort of historical principles surrounding it, um, and coming to the conclusion that I did, that a lot of what had been saying, especially about Mike Drescher, didn't comport with what I saw, and whether or not the vote no would uh, really do anything. And in the end, the yes vote was the vote that would have more of a positive impact on Vermont, not just in the near term, but in the long run as well. One thing that I was thinking about afterwards is that I talked about how part of my process, and I know with Seth as well, was the sort of tradition of having it not be a political vote, and politics was set aside, and that's what I had said. And that's true. But one thing that I think is in, sort of implied in what I said, but is not explicit, is that if at any point I had any sense that either one of them had any personal support for the Trump administration, my vote would have been no. And for me, that wouldn't have been a political decision. You can sort of describe it in a lot of ways. It's protecting democracy, patriotism, basic human decency. So that I want to make clear is that neither one of them had any love or support for the Trump administration. It was more difficult to get there with Christina Nolan, frankly, but I did, and I'm very confident in both of those new justices.
And I do just want to follow up with a couple of pieces of that. Why do you think more of your Democratic colleagues did not make the journey that you did during their deliberative process, or what was unpersuasive to you about their reasons for remaining no votes?
Yeah, and to some folks I sent out, Nader, Senator Hashim had shared uh, his floor speech as well, and much of it I don't disagree with. It sort of ultimately came down in the end to the is this the stance that actually will do what we do what they wanted to do, and I didn't think it was. I think the message for Mike Drescher would not have been the correct message, would not have been grounded in reality. But I don't. Fault's not the right word, but I think that the no votes were right too. It's kind of interesting how it works with that, especially in a time now when well, I won't. I'm trying to learn to temper my some of how I'm saying. Like I won't call ICE terrorists right now, but in the times that we're in, the one of the slogans has been "These are not normal times," and I don't think that's even strong enough. This is a time when it used to be when you brought Hitler or the Nazis into an argument, you knew the argument went off the rails. And now that's not true, and it's terrifying. And I know a lot of people are unsafe right now, and so I can understand every no vote that was cast.
And just to stick with that sort of aspect of it, and some of the reasoning that was given is mainly around the role that Michael Drescher played specifically
Yeah,
in the cases of Remeza Ozturk and Mohsen Mahdawi. And I know there's been some effort to clarify what his specific role was. And he also, we discussed this in the last show,
yeah,
in his testimony to the Judiciary Committee, he explained why he personally took on those cases
yeah,
within the office um, under the theory that it may, adversely
yeah,
affect the careers of those who are within the office. Obviously, that
right,
has not been the case for him. Um, but part of his role was arguing the case for the continued detention of
yeah,
Mahdawi and Ozturk. And that is something that the Senate and the House both took up and voted with overwhelming majorities to specifically recommend
right.
against in SR 13 and HR 8 last year. So I think that's something that has also been pointed to as a little bit of a disconnect of those were not close votes. However, the
Yeah, right.
confirmation for Drescher, who was on the government side of those cases, was a very close vote.
Right. Getting into the weeds of that is there's no disconnect for me on that. Our resolutions were to release them, period, to the people that had arrested them and had the power to release them. Mike Drescher did not have that power. The judge had that power, and the judge had to make that decision. And Mike Drescher's role was to make sure that the judge could make that decision. And frankly, he did a little bit afterwards too, both with Mohsen McDowey in terms of the temporary restraining order to keep him in Vermont had been issued. He called, made sure he didn't get on the plane. He would have been on a plane. I think it was either the plane was late or they missed the first plane, but the second one he didn't get on, in part because Mike Drescher ordered I believe it was HSI at that point, to not do it. And also you heard Seth's discussion on how Remes Ozturk was released without conditions from Louisiana. Her role, her detention was her detention was part of the horrible process that is going on right now, shuffling people throughout the country and keeping them detained much longer. But for me, there was no disconnect in terms of Mike Drescher's role. And you had mentioned that that he took on the case because it would be a little less impact on him. I think he fully expected that he would be fired for what he had done, because he did exactly what happened in Massachusetts. Was he candored to the court? And I really was looking, especially with the arguments for not releasing them. But what I saw was, here, judge, I'm going to present what there is. Please make a decision. And I don't know. People have told me afterwards. I think that perhaps Washington was just not looking at Vermont, and that's why he wasn't just taken out right away, and that they didn't have someone come in to monkey up the process. But that was my reading of it, and I think, as well, maybe as folks don't know, but that was a very difficult vote for me. Even right before I said yes, I paused. I say, am I doing this? And yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I know, and in last week's show, Representative Nigro, you mentioned that you were one of the people that Senator Plunkett had called on during his deliberative process. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that sort of conversation, how that went for you, and also just looking at your Senate colleagues having to take on such a difficult question, what that's like for you on the House side.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rob just was, excuse me, Senator Plunkett was just doing due diligence, and again, listen, this was his decision. He didn't have to check in with anybody in the House. I just appreciate that I think he was trying to gather all the information he could to make the best choice he could, and I appreciate the position he was in. Besides that, as I said, I don't want to. It's this is the Senate's vote and our senators' vote, and I don't want to try to speak on their behalf. But I appreciate the thinking and the process that Senator Plunkett clearly put into it, and I will say one of the things that concerns me often on a national level is when you see situations where everybody feels like politicians go into every situation with a decision made in advance, and even in Minneapolis, some of the one of the worst parts of that whole thing was this instantaneous response from the administration that they knew exactly what happened and they immediately judged. And so, I mean, I just appreciate a different approach and, a thoughtful approach. And I don't think we should go into any situation instantly assuming we know the answer. These are complicated issues. They take time and deliberation.
And moving over to you, Representative Cooper, again, sort of looking at those, looking at the actions that the Senate and the House took last year around the continued detention of Mohsen Mahdawi, how does this, I think Senator Plunkett very eloquently explained how he sees the connection there and Michael Drescher's role in their cases. But I'm just wondering from your perspective, looking at this, what does it sort of look like to you?
It was a pretty emotional day last year when Mohsen was in the Capitol. I mean, that was, I think, for a lot of, when he's in the Representatives Hall, I think it was, there was a lot of relief. There was a lot of admiration, I think, and a lot of, it felt like we can get where we need to get. If there's mistakes or if decisions are made that we don't believe in, we have ways of fixing that, or our system can correct the record if need be. And so that was, I think, it's pretty powerful last year when Motion was able to join us in the hall, sort of in the Capitol, in the cafeteria, just another Vermonter, and you're just another resident, and that kind of that felt good to see. And my hope is, and I think while we had a lot going on in the House, so the Senate's work was kind of we weren't directly involved in it, and it was I think it gave the length of the time it took to get from sort of the nomination through the vetting to the vote, did give a lot of people a chance to do as Mike said, to think a little bit. We don't know. Let's hear more. But it is interesting where you have these divisions between what you have responsibility for and what you do not have responsibility for. And as Senator Plunkett put it, there was the judge in this instance is the deciding factor, is the fulcrum here, not the attorney. And there's a lot to be said for bearing that in mind. So there's, they always say that the devil's in the details. The headlines are the big print, and everything else under that is the fine print. And so, yet another day where I'm lucky to be in the House of Representatives and not in that other chamber.
One sort of thematic thread I want to pull on here is this sense of the system, and is it working or is it not working? And I think we all see on a national level the ways in which systems that we previously took for granted are pretty broken down. Excuse me. We see ways that those systems are pretty broken down or are not functioning or are being weaponized. And some of the reasoning that several senators gave for not voting to confirm Mike Drescher was concern that it would erode trust in the system that is operating the judiciary system. I guess I'm sort of curious because part of what has also come up as a theme here is that really the deliberative system and looking deeply into how this is operated is that the system is kind of working here in Vermont against these headwinds. And so I'm interested for your perspective, Representative Corcoran, of how much it feels like the system within the state house and within the state is still functioning relatively well. Relationships between people who are on opposite sides of the aisle, the ability to have deliberative processes that result in responsible decisions. I think there have been moments where there has been some question around that. We had the revelations around the group chat of young Republicans that included a senator who has since left office. But there have been these moments where it feels like some of this national breakdown is touching us here in Vermont. And the theme that I'm hearing around this process for Michael Drescher is really our system is working here and there are ways for us to sustain it. Is that your sense? Does that feel like what's happening in the State House and more broadly within the state?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're far cry from what's going on in Washington. I think we're miles ahead of the collaboration and trying to get to the end game that's beneficial to all Vermonters. I know on our side of the House, the Speaker is always including Republicans, progressives, Democrats, independents. In their conversations to get to a compromise. So no, I think the process does work. And going back to the tough decision that Seth and Rob had, I would just say I'm honored to have them as my senators because it just would have been easy to say yep, no, and being done with it. And for them to take the time and sort of separate all the political pushback from what was in front of them and to digest it and take the time and sit down with both potential judges and to hear it out is refreshing because if this was in Washington, they would have said no on face value and they would have been done with it. And that's, I think, the difference is to hear the facts and to come to your own conclusion. And and also too, maybe Rob can talk about this, is how these two candidates came forward. This was on a board, and I think you need 3/4 of recommendation to advance. So it wasn't just the Senate voting on it. These were three people or candidates that were put forward by an independent board. So yeah, to answer your question, we're miles ahead of Washington, and we do our best to all come together, and turn off the noise and do what's right. And we haven't shut down the government. We haven't done any of that stuff. So we're a lot better than Washington for sure.
Maybe not the lofty bar that we wish to set for ourselves, but still a good one to clear.
For sure.
Before we move on to another topic, Senator Plunkett, I just want to give you a last chance if there's anything that was said you want to respond to, or anything else you want to share about this.
No, I appreciate, frankly, I appreciate all of our representatives. I didn't get to talk to everyone. Some folks I kind of knew what their positions were before deciding. But just in terms of whether I suppose our systems or institutions are working in Vermont differently from Washington, and I don't really have much to compare it to, this being my first time up there. But I agree with Tim that in the State House there's collaboration all over the place, and collegiality in general. What I've seen in our courts, it's the same. It works the way it has been for a long time. I've heard a lot about our federal bench and how we're deeply lucky to have them, and knowing that essentially how well they will do in their judgment. So the institutions, I think, are definitely there. What was new to me, especially after this vote, was being threatened. That had not really crossed my mind. And it just so happened, after I got the threatening email, we had a safety briefing at the State House, and we were, I'm not going to talk about what we were told, but there's a heightened number of threats that have been happening over a period of time, and we were given some recommendations, including that little plate that we have. I took it off. I'm not going to be as visible driving around town anymore. I've been followed a couple of times, and it's there is that in Vermont as well, and I think it's not to the level of animus that we see in other parts of the country. But I know that I'm safe, but so many people in Vermont are not, and we have to keep that in mind. Our institutions might be working, but there are times when the institutions are too slow. Quite frankly, they always are too slow, and there might be something else that we can do. And we saw the students in Burlington. They did it, and those are the heroes.
On the topic of large institutions and slow-moving change, I want to bring us to some of the news that came through this week on education reform in the state of Vermont. We did have the first sort of attempt at redrawn maps that came out of the House Education Committee. It was looking at the current 119 districts and consolidating them down to 27. Obviously, this map is and has literally been called by those who created it a starting point. But it does give an indication of sort of where things are. It doesn't match with all of the requirements, the districts that were drawn on this map that Act 73 from last year would have asked for, particularly around the size of districts related to student population. But as a first attempt, Representative Cooper, I'm sort of interested in your assessment of what this looks like, and maybe specifically what it looks like for us here in Bennington.
There's the education reform in the legislature, and then there's sort of what's going on right now around the state. And I think many of you are aware that the school board in Reedsboro will have in March a decision about whether to become a non-operational school district, the Reedsboro Central School. That is a building for 130 or so students that has about 40 in it, but it's a a lively little place. And not too long ago, I was actually able to join an event there where 3 members of the Vermont Symphony Orchestra were on hand to teach kids how to make their own brass instruments with some hose and a funnel, and some imagination and some patience from whichever trusted adults are around. I think the starting point, and it's I don't believe that map is disheartening. What's disheartening is that we've had several starting points and over several years, but with this particular bill, it seems like a number of starting points just in the last 8 to 10 months. That does lead to some uncertainty, and I have to think that some of that uncertainty is playing into the decisions that have been made to close schools, say in Sunderland. That is, people are wondering, well, why don't I act while at least I know what the rules of the game are and what the options will be? But as Senator Plunkett said, the institutions can't keep up. They can't move fast enough to be able to give people the decision-making, ability, or the time they need for that decision-making ability. And over the years, we've always had a little bit of a funky hitch in how we have our December 1st letter with sort of speculating around taxes, and then we go into town meeting day, and then we kind of figure out what's happening with the school budgets, and then the fiscal year is coming to a close, and so there's always these like tinkerings going on, the Budget Adjustment Act, truing up budgets, and sort of partway through the fiscal year. So I get the sense that in looking at what Representative Conlon and his committee had produced, it made some sense as I looked at it. I couldn't say for sure about the rest of the state, but I sort of understood where some of the lines were within Bennington County and why they were where they were. But at this point, it'll be an opportunity to hear more as people who are more involved and more informed, organizations representing educators, representing superintendents and principals, have a continued opportunity to weigh in. I'll have to leave it at that because that's been, I have been, felt fortunate to be on the Committee on Commerce and Economic Development, where we have a lot of good work happening there, and to sort of check in with my colleague in education as things develop.
And Representative Niagara, I just want to follow up with you on that, because I think sometimes there's a sense, and this is a theme that's come up a couple times in our discussions around what this statewide education reform looks like, that because Bennington County overall is a less rural county than some of those that will be most affected, that it doesn't, it obviously will affect things here very significantly, but maybe not in the same structural ways that it will in other parts of the state. But to Representative Cooper's point, this uncertainty makes all sorts of things much more urgent for a lot of folks. And there are more rural schools or, other, however we describe them, private schools or there's a couple of different terms that are being used in the changes to the legislation that are well-known entities within the county. How does this look like it's playing out to you for the sort of Bennington County region?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say I looked at the map that came out, and obviously starting point map. There's some sections on there already that have been identified as that's not going to work, but at least give us something to work with and start the conversation or restart the conversation, perhaps. I've said throughout the process last year that for my district, for the town of Bennington itself, we probably are looking at less impact than pretty much anywhere in the state, and for the most part, probably would benefit from most versions of what I've seen. Obviously, some of the smaller communities around us in the county might be a little bit of a different story. But again, for my focus on my district, I certainly haven't seen anything that's going to have a significant negative impact. But again, similar to Rep. Cooper, I gotta say that I'm following what education is working on, but it also doesn't do us that much benefit to spend an enormous amount of time on a map that we know is not that close to a final version. So right now, my focus is much more on the state budget and keep checking in as things develop. But I don't see a huge impact, certainly in my district so far.
And kind of to that point, something that we did hear about in the very first episodes was the sort of tenor and tone of the legislative session set by the governor, with how strenuously he's urging action on education. And to your point, Representative Cooper, the sort of disheartening nature of many starts. There's a task force that is going to recommend a map. Well, they did their deliberative work and they did not recommend a map. So now there's a map being recommended by the House committee. I want to sort of ask you, Representative Corcoran, how does this intense focus on something so difficult that does seem like it is starting and stopping or changing in so many ways, again, to Representative Nigro's point, like, not a ton to pay attention to in this new start map, although there's a lot to pay attention to. What does that do for the nature of the legislative session, where obviously you're focused on your committee work, but you know that there's something else so big and uncertain sort of moving alongside it?
Yeah, no, it's no doubt it puts us behind the eight ball. We thought, I'm not saying it was right or wrong, but we thought we were going to hit the ground running with a map that was presented to us. And it didn't play out that way. So we're, behind the game a little bit. And yeah, it is. It's frustrating in the fact that I think Vermonters expect us to curb our property taxes. And in order to do that, we have to come up with some type of new proposal how we fund our education system. And it is going to be hard to do, extremely hard to do. I think right now, my heart of hearts, if I was a betting man, it's slim that I think that we're going to be able to pass something out of our side and then go over the Senate and have them concur and then have the governor sign off on something. I think right now, as I'm looking at it, is going to be hard. I mean, I'm giving it under probably 50% chance, maybe closer to, 10 to 20. Not saying that nothing's going to happen, but we have a long ways to go. And this map that was just introduced a couple weeks ago, I'm taking the approach as, I want to hear the feedback from our superintendents and how they feel about it. And I'm sure we're going to be having a meeting here shortly with the supervisory union and get their input. So, but I agree with Mike. At the end of the day, I think Bennington overall should be fine with the class minimums and everything else. But I just think the overall impact to the rural communities to get that across the finish line is going to be tough. I'm not even sure there's going to be enough votes to get it out of the committee, as this currently constructed right now with this map. So that's the frustrating part is that Vermonters, I think they said our property taxes are enough, but then you have the argument is obviously it's about the kids. Obviously, we have to structure it so where they're not on a bus for an hour each way going to school if they have to, if their school is unfortunately shut down, for them to commute. So there's just a lot of balls up in the air, and we have a limited time to do this, hopefully May, we'll be out of there. Who knows if that's going to be extended, but yeah, no, it's hard to sort of really engage. Our system works is we let the committee process work. They're doing their due diligence. Obviously, we hear, if we hear feedback from our end, we'll relay it. But right now, it's sort of the education committee is doing their due diligence and trying to make this work. And they're have an uphill battle for sure. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be people that are fine with it, and then people that are going to be quite upset. So it's a tough one for sure.
And Senator Plunkett, sort of looking in from the Senate side on this move from the House this week. We don't have Senator Bongartz with us, chair of the Senate Education Committee, but knowing that their committee has also been diligently taking testimony and moving, trying to move things forward. Sort of what's the Senate view on this right now?
Yeah. And I know at least from Seth's standpoint, he's trying to work in parallel, although they don't. I think the plan is to have the House send the bill over as well. I don't have really any more insight than the representatives have on this. I suppose the only thing I can add is that we did have a long discussion sort of about different aspects of this. There's some data in finance that is just terrifying if you look at it, but it's too early to look at it because it's based on old data. And there's a lot of that we're looking at where, well, we don't have enough yet, but we also know that the governor is going to require something in the end. And the way one person put it is, we've got like maybe 4 or 5 bullets. We're going to have to like bite at least one of them. And people are going to be unhappy. And it's just how it's going to end up. And different pockets will be more unhappy than others. And I agree with Mike and Tim about Bennington itself will probably work out pretty well. The entire county itself is this weird mishmash, however, and from Act 73, there were a lot of schools that the reduction in the number of independent schools hit a number of them hard. So that's already happened. So I think that at least the way the governor is presenting it is that some things are going to have to be done and everyone's going to have to bite some bullet. And it's going to be really our obligation to be able to explain it as well as we can when it comes out. And frankly, to say, yes, this is not perfect, but we do have an imperfect system and it's going to take a lot of imperfections along the way to fix it. So I suppose that's the only thing I can add to that.
And kind of sticking with education, but shifting gears a little bit, I do want to come to our representatives about H 640, which is about having voting student members on school boards and also non-voting student members on middle school boards. This is a bill that's coming forward. I know here in Bennington, the one sort of corollary piece is that we did have the proposed charter change to allow youth voting. Not exactly the same thing, but similar in the idea of youth involvement and representation. And that amendment did fail by 694 votes, much more than the other failed amendment, which was for non-citizen voting, which only failed by 75. As this is moving forward, are you sort of seeing this as a positive step for student representation and school board representation? There's a lot of sort of legal pieces that need to be figured out in terms of how these student members would function on boards as voting members. But I'll start with you, Representative Cooper.
So here's one that I think won't come off the wall. It's had its hearings and it's had 2, I think, so far. I am expecting that what you see on that bill is a few members of the education committee. I think the lead sponsor, Representative Glover, Representative Harpel of Glover, is has sort of really, I think, in her first term, become a kind of trusted voice, and as she's a teacher, and she's really had a lot of important things to say and perspectives to share around education reform, chiefly Act 73, but also you can see thinking more broadly on different levels. And you see in the co-sponsors of that bill, people from rural areas, people from cities. So, you don't see people from Bennington County, but that's not because we intuitively don't want to support that. I do think that where there is the opportunity and the administrative capacity for determining just what you would put your fingers on there, Jack, with respect to how will it look, how will it operate, I think that there is there may be places that have resources to sort of support that, to stand that up, and to have those roles be defined. And we're looking at something much more, we're positing something more robust than student council. So, I think it's important that everybody sort of have their eyes wide open about that. And I think part of the reason this is relevant is that if we do undergo any sort of shifts in supervisory union or district borders. We now have to figure out, government operations and military affairs will have to work on these new voting districts. I am sensitive to the importance of voting districts and ballot activity. It's that's significant. So I think that the bill proposes something that allows for more voices to be heard, and by and large, that's something that we've seen representatives showing some interest in, sort of citizens assemblies that are, sort of running parallel to general assemblies. There is some sort of legislative interest around that. And I think that this is one where, if we as we hear more back from some of the Act 73 proposals, we may be surprised by what we hear from people who more locally and closer to home are really interested in this. I will say, Jack, this was not one that I was expecting to hear about in the show. And sometimes when these surface, we get feedback from constituents that are glad to have heard about it on, in session. And I may find out that there's more support or more interest in it around the Bennington 1 district than I am aware of at this time.
And here in Bennington, there has recently been the creation of a youth council, and there's some energy around what that will look like. There have been a couple of presentations to the select board in the last couple of months, and ACT Bennington has been really involved with that effort to make sort of an official youth council. And so seeing some of those local connections, this is also, my understanding is that this is legislation that's similar to what some of our neighboring states have in place, such as Massachusetts and New Hampshire. So I'm curious, Representative Nigro, for your perspective on how many of these questions that are coming up around the legislation are sort of difficult to answer, or there might be some places to draw on to to inform at least answers to how this kind of a change would function.
So let me start by being 100% honest. While Jonathan was speaking, I was looking the bill up because I think I'd heard the headline on it before, but have not followed it much. And there's a reality in the State House, which is like was said a moment ago, when a bill's not coming off the wall, I don't usually spend a lot of time on it, or when we don't predict it will. I guess my fast answer, which is probably all I have since I haven't spent a lot of time on this, is that I fully support creative ways to get students more engaged in government and more active in their community. I think we need to have a much better focus on civics, and to whatever degree this is a pathway for that, I like the idea. I'm hesitant at the point of a vote. I know, as you mentioned, the charter change that did not pass relating to youth voting. So I guess I would not be ready to personally commit to giving an actual vote to students. But at the same time, I think that some of the idea and thrust behind it to get students involved, active, and have a voice, I really appreciate.
And on this subject of bills that do or don't get off the wall, Representative Corcoran, could you speak to just what that means for any folks who might not know what getting a bill off the wall means in a session?
Let me unmute here. Sure. I mean, every year, every biennium, we're inundated with I don't even know what we're up to, like 1,000 bills, whatever the number is. So a lot of them, when a bill is introduced, will be right on the floor for the first time, and then it's referred to the appropriate committee, and then it goes basically on a wall. In order for us to take it down, there's a different process for that. There's no hard, fast rule. I was always brought up or taught that it's the chair's discretion. If whoever the chair is wants to take it down and take testimony, they can. Other committees have a more democratic process where they'll vote, they'll rank, they'll look at all the bills that are on their wall, and they'll rank the top 5 that they want to take up for that particular year, and then they'll physically, start taking testimony on it. And, with this particular bill, it sounds like they were taking testimony on it, but like I said, I'm not too in depth. It might have been out of courtesy for the sponsor. But at the end of the day, it doesn't sound like that's going to be brought to the floor. So yeah, that's what it means when having it stayed on the wall. There's not enough support, or it's a chair's discretion of we're going to leave it on the wall and not take up testimony. But as far as that underlying bill, I agree with Mike. I'm all for engaging students and getting them involved. But I would have extreme hesitation. I always look at it. If you don't have skin in the game, it's a lot easier to say yes or no to things. And when they're not, I'm not saying not contributing, but not, paying taxes or, don't have really true effect for some of the consequences or decisions that they're making. They're like, should you have a voting role? But again, if they parceled it out and said, it's just purely policy and not monetary, where they could vote and not vote, I guess it all depends on how it's structured. But at the end of the day, I'm not, I don't believe it's going to come out of committee, but that's just, where it stands now. Everything can change, but I don't think it's going to be voted out.
Thank you for that context. Senator Plunkett, obviously, if you have any thoughts on it, I want you to be able to share them, but I am going to shift gears a little bit back to some sort of national questions that have come to the Senate in the last week. There was a vote on S-208, which was banning law enforcement from basically wearing masks, from face coverings, with a number of carve-outs for times within their duties when they may need to wear face coverings, such as N95 masks to prevent the spread of disease, protections from chemical irritants, protections for water. There's a list in the bill of all the different sort of carve-outs for normal duties that may require someone to cover their face for that reason. There was obviously also some national news around California's effort to pass similar legislation, which was then on Monday of last week, basically halted by an order from a federal judge. So just looking for your sort of, particularly not just as a senator, but also as one of the lawyers, your insights into how this bill was crafted, and now that it has been voted forward, what does it really mean?
Yeah. So first of all, high school students on school boards, I think it's great. I'll just leave it at that. Knowing that it's not going to be passed at all. But all right, so S-208, S-209, and there's also, and I forget what the bill number is. There's a education bill about schools having policies and procedures, basically when ICE comes knocking on the door. So S-208, that's the law enforcement mask prohibition. And so just referencing the California law, our bill is modeled on that to a great degree, with one major exception. So not all of the California law was struck down. It was only when it comes to masking of federal law enforcement. Ours is all law enforcement across the board. It doesn't matter. And that was really the key problem with the California bill. The process that Senator Hashim and the Judiciary Committee went through is to go through this with fine detail to determine whether or not there is any sort of federal supremacy statute or law in general that would essentially preclude us from doing this at all. They did a deep dive into that and found that there was nothing. And then there's discussions with law enforcement around the state on whether or not that would be have an impact. There was one question on the floor when we voted for it, and whether or not federal agencies came and testified. And what we heard is generally they won't. They won't come and testify, and I found that in my own realm. When we've tried to subpoena a federal officer, they essentially ignore it, and we have not gone through different steps to try to bring them in. Exceptions to that, of course. So in terms of what it will do, and at least what my view of this is, and I mentioned earlier I wasn't going to refer to ISIS terrorists, but this is something where what we've been seeing at least one portion of our federal law enforcement used as a private army to put forward a political policy to fundamentally change the structure of our country culturally, socially, and legally. And what has been done is a certain portion of our population has been actually terrorized by this with the masks, with the full body gear. That's the whole reason for it. And it is to terrify not only the person that's being arrested at the time, but everybody else, and to see that this is happening and believe that it can happen. And there's no need for it whatsoever. I know a long time ago, Becca Ballin got a lot of heat for one comment on who was being arrested, and unfortunately I forget her name, but the woman in Manchester that was arrested, masked men. She literally did that. She was an LNA. There was no danger to anybody in taking her into custody. It was only to terrorize everybody. And so this is really a step where Vermont can do this. We can say, no way, we're not going to let you do this. This is a due process issue. That this type of arrest, much like, overuse of force or use of deadly force, this is the same sort of thing, where if it's a situation where it's completely not needed, we're not going to allow law enforcement to do it. And I wholly support this, and this is something Vermont can do. S209, similar. It's just in terms of where particular arrests can take place. And I hope that answered your question. But these two bills and the other one to a degree, I'm very excited about, because these are something where this is actual pushback. This is something where we can say this is not okay, and then it'll have to go through our courts on what federal officers are legally allowed to do in Vermont, and I think that we're well prepared to address that and say that not here, it doesn't happen here, or at least it's going to stop. So hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. And to that question about the California legislation that it's modeled on, and sort of what journey that has been on, and what we might expect in the next weeks and months as this moves forward, there was a great deal of pushback from local law enforcement and local law enforcement organizations to the bill in California, even though it was focused on federal actions, and that's part of what's held it up. The Peace Officers Research Association of California put out a statement basically saying that the bill was a threat to community safety and the operations of local law enforcement as well. Do we expect some level of pushback from local law enforcement or from some of the police unions around this, as seeing this as restrictive to their ability to carry out their duties?
Yeah, and from my own perspective as a prosecutor, I'm obviously not speaking for anyone, but just it's hogwash that it's a threat to public safety. Absolute hogwash. I have not heard of pushback from our local law enforcement. As I mentioned, they were in there to testify and mentioned where the issues would be. And other than cold, I don't know of any time when our locals have done that. Perhaps when, and this is one of the carve outs, when it's essentially the SWAT team going in. But the question is, is this going to lead to pushback on law enforcement? Or people are going to be able to identify them, and they're going to, well, that happens now. It's not any different. And if our law enforcement are doing something where they believe that they have to be masked to hide their wrongdoing, then it shouldn't happen. And so at least I have not heard anyone say that this is a major issue for local law enforcement.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me this morning for an excellent conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in many upcoming episodes of In Session.
Thank you so much, Jack.